Welcome to this workshop for the Rotorua Museum Strengthening and Restoration Project. This is the second workshop in a series of workshops to address the several areas of the Museum Strengthening Project. This meeting is being live streamed, and so we welcome those that are watching via live stream, and we have some visitors in the gallery as well. Welcome to you also. I'd just like to remind everyone to please make sure your phones are turned off, and the session we're aiming to conclude at about 3:15, all going well, because the third workshop starts at 3:15. We have Councillor Waru and Councillor Brown joining us via Zoom. Good afternoon. And also we have an apology from Councillor Maxwell because he needs to be in Wellington for an event. This afternoon we're going to start with a presentation about the Council's financial strategy and Rotorua Lakes Council levels of investment. Thomas is going to present today a review of the Council's debt, how it is managed and how it is used to fund investment into future infrastructure. So this session should provide an understanding and give an idea of what capacity is available for potential further investment in the museum potentially, and the financial strategy of our organisation. Thomas will he's got a PowerPoint presentation which he will give, and he's suggested that perhaps he might break throughout the presentation to allow time for questions. So we'll take that questions along the way if that's okay with councillors. And on that note, I'd like to invite Thomas to present to us, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, councillors. I think as the Chair highlighted, Marty, is this? Presentation doesn't seem to want to work. There we go. Good way to start. As highlighted by the Chair, just going to be talking about a couple of different aspects around some of the differences between personal, business and public debt, the levers that are available to us with regards to managing that debt, what are our debt limits and sort of how are they set, how debt is being used, what our projected debt levels and risks sits, and then there'll be some questions at the end, obviously, of what are the implications of all of that mean with regards to the museum project and where you are at and some of the decisions in front of you. So to keep things, I guess, very simple, you know, if I was to compare the personal debt versus business debt versus public debt, and personal debt, you generally buying an asset, whether that's a car or predominantly a house, is what most people do. Your ability to borrow is obviously based on your income, and those borrowings are secured against that asset predominantly, and you generally structure your borrowings over a term that is comfortable for you. So if you are later in life and borrowing a big asset, you'd probably generally pay it off quicker. If you are younger in life and acquiring a bigger asset, you might choose to spread that across a longer period. From a business perspective, generally slightly different. So they're generally investing to acquire a piece of, might be a machinery or equipment that's or a property, and it's generally designed to provide an economic return, and that'll be over the life of it as well. And so generally you'd structure your borrowings around what is the sort of economic return that you can achieve and targeted for how long and so forth. And you're making business decisions based on the asset, the yield, etc. Public debt is a little bit different from those. Generally it is used for to acquire long-term public infrastructure, and public infrastructure can mean anything from roading to wastewater treatment plants to stadiums to sports fields to reserves. So it's things that are of public of nature and generally have a very long life and a generally multi-generational period. And the borrowings themselves are, and how they're funded and returned is generally tied to that life of that asset. And I'll go in a little bit more detail around intergenerational equity and why sometimes we borrow for a longer period. I guess from a simplistic perspective, if you were to compare, let's say myself and my personal capacity, I might buy a home and I would take a mortgage, and generally, the goal of most banks is to have 20% equity. However, you can borrow with a much higher leverage ratio, and you'd look at where I am at life, my ability to pay, and I would structure my borrowings around towards the end of my working career that I hopefully have paid off my mortgage, and you generally tie the terms to those sorts of aspects. With regards to council, sorry, I'm conscious I speak quiet, microphone close. We have about $1.5 billion worth of assets and about $350 million worth of debt. So the debt to equity ratio is quite different from, say, someone who has either entered and just bought a property or partway through that. And there's not solely a person or two people paying it off, it is obviously the rate payers. And over time, the rate payers should grow as a district grows, and so there is no real finite life with regards to the community that is paying for that debt. Ultimately, therefore, you make decisions on how to use debt and the term based on the infrastructure that you are borrowing to invest into. I mentioned intergenerational equity before, and this was something that was, I think, came about probably in the early 2000s when I think the world started, local government as well, started entering more into the debt space, and with regards to having to invest into more key infrastructure. And so what it recognises is that when you invest into infrastructure, there are effectively two sets of beneficiaries. There are the current ratepayers, and then there are also the future ratepayers, because as you can imagine, let's take a wastewater treatment plant. It generally has a life of 20 to 30 years, and the ratepayers of today might not all be the same ratepayers in the future, and those ratepayers in the future will be benefiting from a component of the economic life of that infrastructure. And so what we do is when we borrow to invest into infrastructure, look to borrow for a length whereby not just the current ratepayers are paying a fair share of the contribution towards the investment and repayment, but also appropriate future beneficiaries of that asset as well. What that doesn't mean is we don't look to structure our borrowings incredibly long just to stretch it out, but you do look at it for the life. So as an example, we're currently undertaking a wastewater treatment plant upgrade. It has a resource consent life, and so the borrowings that are attached to the investment that's needed are targeted to be repaid via the rates over the life of that consent, and that consent will be multi-generational. Happy to take any questions to hear if there are any.
Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Thomas. So we have no problem with our asset to debt ratio, but there is an affordability issue, isn't there? So how much rates do our ratepayers pay? Well,
our ratepayers, as you know, pay
30,000 of them together.
Yeah, the total rates bill?
Yes.
I don't have the number exactly off the hand. Are you talking about total rates or are you talking about debt?
Total rates.
About 100 million.
About 100 million, cool. How much interest do we pay on our, did you say 350 million debt?
It's about 9 million.
About 9 million a year. And so we're paying off how much debt at a time? So that would be the interest only, but we're paying off capital as well.
Yeah, we are, yes.
So how much of that, shall we call it debt servicing together?
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I don't have the exact figures
Ballpark.
Here. So which bit?
The cost of servicing debt out of our $100 million in rates revenue.
I can get the exact number if you
Sure.
like.
Sure, well, let's do it.
Answer incoming.
So, I think, as I said before, it's about 9 million is the total financing. I don't know the top of my head how much would be debt servicing. But as I said, if you take our current borrowings, each of them is tied to an asset, and each asset has a different lifespan with regards to retiring that debt.
Yes.
Yep.
So I'm trying to focus on the servicing of debt.
Yep. So what I think I might do here, Councillor, is that a little bit later on in the presentation, I've actually got a slide that shows our debt projection. And on that slide, you'll actually see a year where council is not actually planning on borrowing, and you'll see a reduction in debt, and that might be actually the appropriate time to have this discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions at this stage? There appear to be none. Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah. So where do we borrow and how do we apply it for? So per our financial strategy, and we've been fairly consistent with this over the years, we apply borrowings and only use borrowings to invest into new infrastructure or the renewal of existing infrastructure with regards to projects of significance where there's a level of service improvement. So we don't borrow to fund our renewal program. And so currently we have about $1.7 billion worth of assets now, because obviously we're continuing to invest and they're also being revalued, and we have about $340 million worth of debt as we speak to support that. And then going forward, that is under our current long-term plan projected to be at about 450 million peaking, and at that time we will anticipate to have closer to about $2 billion worth of debts, because obviously that debt growth is all going into projected infrastructure that we're looking to invest into.
Just a discussion that Thomas. It's an important distinction, I think, to try and draw. What these bars actually lead you to conclude is that there is just one level of debt, if you like. There's a big bucket called debt, and it's a bit like your mortgage. So you've just got one mortgage and you're paying that off, and if you add to that mortgage, then the mortgage grows. What Thomas was actually alluding to before was that what we have, for example, is sewage projects which are spread over a lifetime, and that project will have a debt attributed to it. The payment of that debt will be paid off through a targeted rate mechanism. So whilst this is at a very summary level, there is a lot of detail below it. So each of these bars are effectively made up of a number of different asset types and classes, all with different lifespans, which is why you get the changes over time.
Cool. So levers that are available to us. So if we take that, we borrow for specific infrastructure, we look at the life of that infrastructure, we structure the borrowings accordingly to it. Depending on the infrastructure, it's funded through different things, predominantly from targeted rates if it is infrastructure in nature. So what are the levers available with regards to managing our debt? And so one aspect is we can reduce our capital spend. So by reducing our capital spend, and in particular the investment into new infrastructure or improving our infrastructure, that therefore means we won't be taking on more debt, and the funding that we currently have available and set aside for servicing our debt means that over time will reduce. We could also reduce our operating spend by reducing our operating spend and creating larger operating surpluses. That means that we have more cash available to pay down debt quicker than what we anticipated or what we plan to do. And thirdly, we can also increase our revenues. So by increasing your revenues, you can apply more of those revenues towards debt retirement. And so, again, it's very similar to each of us in our own personal circumstances. If you can choose to borrow for certain things or not, and if you want or have the capacity, you can not spend as much and use more of your income or disposable income for debt retirement and managing your debt in those levels. And so we are effectively the same. It's just, I think, as our Chief Executive highlighted, we do talk about debt in totality, recognising that the debt itself is made up of multiple different things that we borrowed for, all structured in different mechanisms over different periods of time and funded differently. But we always talk about it as in totality when we have these discussions. So what is our debt ceiling? So unlike personal and business debt, where debt is secured against the asset itself, for public debt and central government, and we are the same, our debt is secured against our income. And so therefore, unlike borrowing against an asset where you are limited generally by the level of debt that you can take on by the value of the asset, ours is tied to our income and our servicing ability. And so as a sector, we have an external debt ceiling that we can't exceed without implications, and that is 290%, with that reducing to 280% in 2005-6 onwards. And the reason why that is reducing is because the limit was raised during COVID times, and it was recognised that as we progressed through that limit should reduce. However, internally, and this is something that the council consults on and does every 3 years as part of the long-term plan, we set ourselves an internal debt ceiling. And so internally, we have a 250% debt limit, and that is the one we work in and manage towards. Any questions on that element?
Councillor Kaifong.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just go back to that previous slide then? So you had the debt levers. Effectively, could you just comment, we've pretty much pulled the reduce operational expenditure and the ability to raise additional revenue lever pretty hard already in terms of the annual plan. So there's really not much room to manoeuvre in terms of that. So really is the only realistic debt lever that we have to influence debt level is the top one.
Yeah, so remember you did reduce operational spend in the annual plan, but you did that to reduce your revenue. So therefore, to use that lever, you would have to reduce spend and leave the rates revenue where it is to then use that surplus to apply to debt. So yes, we haven't been able to do that. So at the moment, with regards to reducing debt, you would have to look at the capital investment going forward and make decisions around prioritising that, deferring that, or stopping that. Or alternatively, trying to find alternative ways of funding it, such as with third parties or other entities to help.
Thank you. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What is our debt ceiling in terms of dollars?
So I'll get to that in a minute, Councillor. Yep.
What are the implications of exceeding the debt ceiling?
Yep. So the internal, exceeding the internal one has a discussion with our funders, and generally the flow-on effects would be a increased cost of borrowing. The external one, though, is mandated, and we can't exceed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And apparently, Councillor O'Brien and I asked too many questions earlier today, so we've been only given one microphone to share to cut our time in half. That's all right. Could I suggest there might be a fourth? This could be a square shape. That it could be increased revenue to apply funds to increase debt retirement instead of
So that's that third wheel, increase revenues to that, So yes, you can increase revenues to fund other things, but that raises the limit, or you can also increase revenues to retire debt, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have anything further?
Oh, sorry, it was just a question. I think Thomas had mentioned that our debt level is tied to our level of income, effectively our ability to service that debt. And the ability to service is currently based on current interest rates, I'm assuming, or have we factored in what is the ability for council to service debt if interest rates were to increase substantially given where we currently are economically?
Yep, so we have quite a complicated treasury management policy that we have to adhere to that provides an element of protection against repricing shock with regards to interest rates. What I am intending to do is PricewaterhouseCoopers is our treasury advisors, and getting them to come along to the next audit and risk committee so we can go into a much more deeper dive with regards to how that works, because I don't think in the hour and 15 I could do it justice with regards to the technicality of it. All I can say is that from our long-term plan perspective, we anticipated a level of increase in financing costs. I think the sharp increase that has occurred recently has caught a lot of people off by surprise. However, what we have done historically and continue to do is we have spread our cost of our financing over a very long period and in multiple tranches. And so we only have approximately a tenth or 10% of our debt maturing every financial year. Unlike, say, some homeowners at the moment that may have their whole mortgage or part of their mortgage repricing in a small period. So therefore we have locked in a lot of those lower rates over the years, and so we're not having that significant impact on our servicing costs as, say, a homeowner is that is having to refinance their whole loan. As part of the work we do with PricewaterhouseCoopers or PwC, they do that forward modelling, and they've got a tool that helps us with regards to understanding that repricing and how to take it on board. And so we've got good visibility of that, and we have an understanding at the moment. I haven't caught up with them in the last month or so, but with the current trends in the repricing and whereas we were, our average cost of borrowing is about 3%. I think we've crept into the high threes now. We're projected to only go to about 5.5% average cost of borrowings within the next 4 to 5 years, and that's a reflection of the financing strategy that we've had in the past with regards to going long term, and in particular locking in rates such as 1.9s and 2.2s and those sorts of percentages. So we don't, in a long way, we don't have that same repricing risk as, say, a homeowner that is seeing the majority of their mortgage repricing in a small calendar year. So that's how we manage that risk.
Any other questions at this stage? Thank you.
So I think I've covered this one off, our debt ceiling. So what does our debt ceiling look like? And it's reflected in a graph. And you'll go, Thomas, why does it peak and drop and all the rest? Because it is based on our total revenue, not just... and so our total revenue does include capital subsidies, in particular for one-off projects. But as you can see, while it might peak and trough over the life of the long-term plan, which is the 10 years that's showing there, is that the debt limit does increase, and that's a reflection that over the 10-year period, council revenues are increasing to match the increase in the cost base. What I've shown you there is the two themselves, so the red being our internal debt limit of 250%, and blue being our external. And from simplicity perspective, I've just put it as 280% rather than having it at 290 and then dropping down for the other half of it. And so you'll see there that between the two there is approximately about a $50 million difference between the two lines for most of that 10-year period. So where does our debt sit? So we are forecast to just creep over $400 million by the end of this financial year, which will be 30th of June 2024. So that's a reflection of the, I think, $61 million borrowings that we have in our annual plan, which is tied to delivering about $120–30 million of capital expenditure. So it is obviously the investment into our infrastructure. And we anticipate that that will peak, double peak, but initial peak in 2026, and then hold and drop a little bit, and then peak again in 2030. And the reason for that peak in 2026 is that's off the back of quite a heavy investment into particular wastewater treatment plant upgrade, completion of Rotorua, looking at Tarawera, but also the infrastructure acceleration fund with regards to the stormwater. So that's driving a lot of the debt, if not most of it, in that 3-year period. And then we do have a period in our current long-term plan where there is a drop off in investment, and then we see a little bit of a peak towards the end of it again. And so what you can see therefore is that where there is no heavy investment into improving and growing our infrastructure, the debt itself can drop back quite quickly, even though on the graph it doesn't look like that. But you are talking, $20–30 million in a very short space of time. So when you overlay the two, and that's the debt graph of 250, you'll see there that while we get close to the debt limit, in particular around 2029, that we do have a bit of a buffer. And the intention in the long-term plan was to always have a buffer, and that buffer was being targeted particularly around the 30–40 million against the internal debt limit, which meant that the council of the day, if there was an emergency or a need, was able to respond to that. Bearing in mind that ultimately we do have that higher limit of the external limit, and so if required, we have probably the two combined in that period of 2025–2026 in particular, provide for $50–80 million, depending on which limit that you had, to be able to respond to the challenges of the time. So happy to pause here and take any questions to this.
Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I find it intriguing that from 2021 to 2024, the debt is going up, and then it gets to the next 6 years, and it's massive consistently, and that's on our watch. How did that go from 2021 to there, other than the stormwater project with the, should I say, the wastewater treatment plant, which is significant, which we didn't agree to, but were done by the previous council? How is all this debt in there when we haven't agreed to any new projects?
Because you are currently operating under the existing long-term plan, and now operating under your current annual plan, which you have approved. And in this current annual plan, which we're now 11–12 days in, we are looking at investing close to $120 million into capital infrastructure, of which 60 million will be funded through borrowings. So that 2024 increase has come under your watch. Yep. Now, for 2025 and 2026, those are things that are in the current long-term plan, which we're about to start a journey on with regards to creating your new long-term plan. And so once you have done your long-term plan, which will be for 2025 onwards, that debt profile will be reflective of the decisions that you make in your long-term plan.
Thank you.
Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do I recall correctly that the previous long-term plan had 60-odd million set aside for the Westbrook Sports Precinct?
Of capital spend or borrowing?
That I'm unsure of. Could you clarify, or do you remember?
So there is a $30 million borrowing commitment in 2030, which is why it does increase out in that year. And that's a reflection that in the future, this council will need to make a decision with regards to investment into its sporting fields and facilities. And as part of your next long-term plan, I have no doubt you will be discussing that quite vigorously.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, councillors?
Yeah. So what you are seeing is 2024 on here is the annual plan which the council has just approved. Obviously 21, 22, 23 was the previous council, and the red lines out from 25 onwards is the current long-term plan, which we will look to reset with regards to looking to go out for consultation on the new long-term plan in April 2024. So about 8 months away now. Greg. Oh.
Sorry, Councillor Brown, please go ahead.
Thomas, I think I know the answer, but I just wanted to check. The debt ceiling in the purple line includes capital subsidies?
That is correct. That is why it peaks and troughs, yes.
Troughs. Yeah, that's right. So I'd imagine rates will always go up. Are you showing any inflationary adjustment to the revenue in this graph or none?
Yes, the years 2025 outwards are based on the inflation and revenues that are showing in our current long-term plan, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Over to you.
Within that, though, there's probably some uncertainty going forward, and I think we need to understand what that uncertainty is. So, Three Waters reform and the debt associated with that is something that is looming in front of us. So at the moment of our existing debt, approximately 100 million is tied to Three Waters infrastructure of things that have already been completed. In front of us is another $30 million with regards to the Tarawera sewage scheme, the wastewater treatment plant with regards to a $60 million upgrade, completing of the Rotorua scheme. Not all of that is obviously into the future, and money to support the IEF stormwater. So significant investment that's going to take place in the next couple of years, which was sitting in the information that sits in front of you, which is why the debt is increasing at the way that it was. It's pretty much reflective of the investment that's going into the infrastructure. Now, depending on what happens at the election, and based on how the Department of Internal Affairs and everyone is still working towards, they anticipate that Three Waters reform will go ahead, and that we will be having a discussion the negotiations around the transition of those services to new entities, and with that transition, when the staff go, contractors go, the assets will go, and the debt will go as well. And so that debt is currently 100 million, but what we do anticipate is obviously a lot of that forward projected debt, a bigger portion of it will go to that new entity, which therefore means from a borrowing capacity, actually council's headroom improves, and so while we would lose the revenues that are associated with the costs of maintaining and looking after that infrastructure, the debt that goes with it as well outweighs the size of the revenue that goes with it too. And so that's just reflective of the fact that we're putting a lot more, and have in the past put a lot more debt applied to infrastructure going forward. And so if it goes ahead, the modelling would indicate while our revenues drop and while our balance sheet drops and while our organisation would shrink in size, our council's ability to borrow and respond into the future actually improves. Councillor?
Thank you. Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. Just to get it in my head, if the unthinkable happens and the same government is returned and this happens, will we then lose control over, let's say, the IAF stormwater? Will that control then go to them, and it will be that decisioning body, that entity that decides which projects go ahead and where, so we don't have a say anymore?
Technically, yes, that the IAF's program of work would have to be reassigned to that new entity along with all the other stormwater activity, and that new entity obviously would have to figure out how it engages with council and its community on prioritising that work. But yes, it would. That program of work would transition as well if this was to go ahead. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. God forbid there's not a change of government and this does go ahead, but how would that affect our debt to assets ratio, Thomas?
It's the math of it. Effectively, more debt is being transferred to the new entity that is being as a proportion of, sorry, when you look at the 250% and you multiply that and you get to what a debt limit is, and you look at the income that is servicing that, it's our total revenue. When you portion of the debt that goes across, and then you portion the revenue that are assigned to those, we have as a percentage a higher level of income left, if you know what I mean, than debt, and so therefore it creates borrowing capacity. It's a hard one to explain, but actually that's how it has worked. Yep.
Did that answer my question about debt?
I think one of the other councillors nodded, so I'm going to go if that answered the question.
Because the assets that we're borrowing on is $1.5 billion.
Remember, the asset value is irrelevant with regards to our borrowing capacity and security. It is actually our income, and so yeah.
It would knock the crap out of our debt to asset ratio, wouldn't it?
I think part of it is so when you think about going forward, we're going to invest into wastewater treatment plant upgrades, etc., and our revenues going forward will be reflective of servicing that debt. And so from a simplistic perspective, if you draw a line in the sand, carve that debt off and carve that revenue off, should all stay the same. But historically, and in particular, a lot of our debt is 15 plus years old. I think the way that it works is that a larger portion of our older historical debt and the length of term, I'm not sure where I'm going here.
Okay, thank you, Thomas.
Oh, David's actually able to answer this one.
Because our debt ceiling is based off our revenue, so the debt ceiling being 2.5 times our revenue, if we lose a third of our revenue to the new entity, which is our water revenue, that means that our debt ceiling does come down. But because so much of our existing and future debt is in Three Waters, that transfer more than compensates for that reduction in headroom. So we do win on that metric.
Thanks, I tied myself up on that one. Thank you, David.
So in other words, the debt to asset ratio is irrelevant.
Yeah, it's debt to income.
Because it's debt to income is the basis of the borrowing. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's further risks attached. So while we showed you the graph and it was our long-term plan out, so current borrowings, what we're projected to borrow for this year's annual plan, and then the LTP out. What we do know is that particularly the LTP out has shifted a bit already, and there's risks to that. I think Councillor Brown asked the question around inflation, so our LTP has a lower rate of inflation built into it than what we're currently experiencing, so therefore the cost of doing things going forward will likely be higher and therefore may need to be supported through a higher level of borrowing. We've been notified by the Minister for the Environment that the 10 million of subsidy that was going towards supporting the Rotorua scheme isn't going through, so we'll have to look at how we fund that and going forward. There are cost escalations with regards to the allowance, what we've allowed for in our LTP with regards to the Rotorua sewage scheme. And it's very likely that we'll get cost escalations around the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund for stormwater, and as part of that agreement is that any escalation in cost due to predominantly inflation falls on the council and not on the government and the DIA. And as well, we have one project that's sitting there we know of with regards to the seismic strengthening of the Blue Baths, which the LTP hasn't made an allowance for, and we also haven't made an allowance in the current draft annual plan. And so going forward, we know that we know where our current borrowing is, we know what we're planning to borrow this financial year as part of our annual plan. We know what's in our LTP, but we also know that that's likely going to change in the next LTP cycle, and we know that there's some risks to some of these things in front of us. And so when you take all of this into account, the debt forecast changes a little bit, and as you can see, that's the change with regards to the risk factor that we've put in, and we get closer to that debt limit. And what you can see as well in 2029, not only do we get close to it, but actually we go a little bit over it. And so that's the forecast of where we are. Now, you'd say, Thomas, are you alarmed at 2029? That is obviously a forecast and could happen, but what I do know is that we are about to go on our do a new long-term plan, at which point pretty much a big portion of our capital investment or infrastructure spend will get reset. You have the ability to obviously look at what goes in there and what is funded, looking at the timing of it. And so this here is a scenario of what's actually occurred if we achieve everything in our current draft annual plan, and if we do everything in the LTP. And the likelihood of all those things actually happening are pretty remote. But what it does signal to you is that if all these things were to come on board, that headroom against our internal limit, particularly in 2026, gets much smaller. And in 2029, if we were to continue on with all these things, that we would be right at or go over our debt limit. Remembering though that this is our internal debt limit. So Gregor, just one more slide, and then and just to remind you that we do have our external debt limit. And so if I overlay that one onto there, is that while in 2029, with all these theoreticals and what ifs and what's forecast to be, there is still close to $50 million of headroom against our external borrowing capacity. And so happy to pause here and take any questions on this.
Councillor Brown.
Thomas, one of the risks that's in there, and I know the answer already, but I just wanted highlighted that if we were to have a cyclone or an earthquake or a catastrophe of some description, we are relying on our external cap limit of 280%. And is that appropriate given the size of our city and the makeup of our population?
No, and I think like any other district or city in New Zealand that's gone through a natural disaster, there would be an element of obviously an additional government support, and I can imagine at the moment that particularly going into Tairāwhiti and Napier and the Hawke's Bay, there's a huge increase in level of investment from central government to help them through that. But yes, what it would mean for us is that our ability to respond without that external assistance is limited to what our head borrowing would be, our borrowing capacity.
Yeah, and I guess the question of whether that's appropriate lands on councillors rather than staff.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Is there any other questions? Yes, Councillor Kaifon.
I think, Councillor Brown was sort of asking my question. It's the previous slide talked about the identified risks, but it's really those unidentified CapEx risks, and obviously climate change is one of them. Potentially managed retreat, given the current situation that we've got. So I don't know what contingency planning there is or headroom we have in relation to, other than we hope the government will come to the party.
And I guess it depends on the size and scale of the event, obviously. If you take Christchurch for an example with regards to the earthquake, the billions that have gone in there to support that, there was no way Christchurch City Council could ever leverage its balance sheet to put that level of investment back in. Versus, say, an example that I do know of, which was the Manawatu-Wanganui Regional Council that had floods in 2004 and was actually quite able to leverage its balance sheet to improve and rebuild its stock banks and do all those sorts of things. So it really does depend on the size and scale of the event.
Yeah.
A good example would be, I guess, with the Cyclone Hale and Gabrielle that did come through, and we did talk to you at the time through the council committees around the additional expenditure that fell upon us. A lot of that actually was supported by government subsidies, in particular through Waka Kotahi to do reinstatement works. And so it's very hard, therefore, for us to do an estimate of what is an appropriate buffer for what is likely to be an incredibly unusual event that they will have different levels of government assistance to support the community through.
Thank you.
Councillor Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just carrying on that train of thought, when we sit down to do our LTP deliberations and we look at the suggested capital expenditure, am I to take it from what Councillor Brown suggested, that we could also factor in more risk protection as opposed to perhaps sacrificing some of our capital expenditure projects just to give us that headroom that we may need, may not? Would that be more financially prudent, to use Councillor Lee's words?
Yeah, so if that's something the council wishes to do through the long-term plan, then that would be embedded into our financial strategy, into the LTP, and that would be something we would be consulting on, yes. Yep.
Any further questions? Oh, Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Thomas. Are we at the stage now where we can answer my earlier questions about the cost of debt servicing out of our...
Yep. So this is the last slide.
Okay.
I guess for me, I'll give my takeaway message at the end of your questions if you like.
Okay.
Yep.
So, did your colleague manage to tell us what our cost of debt servicing is annually?
So it's around 6% of our total revenue. Yep. So remember, councillor, at any time you can look into our annual plan,
Yep.
and in particular our long-term plan, and it clearly maps out and
Yep.
shows what those debt servicing costs are. So my apologies for not memorising them at this occasion.
Is your colleague able to tell us what the total revenue is in the actual dollars?
Sorry, is this relevant to
Yep.
the museum discussion? I'm just mindful of time, and we want to get to the point on the
So
museum.
at the moment, our debt servicing is close to 6% of our total revenue.
You got a further question, Councillor Lee?
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Coughlin.
One final question then, and it just goes back to Thomas's second slide. We talked about different types of debt. So I think your comment was that you pay back the borrowings over the life cycle of the public infrastructure. What is the intended life cycle or intended length of time enduring for a building like that if it was renovated and restored?
Yeah. So for our buildings, it is a little bit different. So we generally look to do about 20 to 25 years. Wastewater infrastructure, water infrastructure is easier because you apply for a resource consent. The resource consent has a finite life, and what we know from experience is that at the end of that life, rules and regulations have changed, and if anything, they always become more onerous, and so therefore the cost of replacing generally requires further investment. So we make sure that the debt attached to that is paid off over the life of that consent. Buildings, people have different interpretations as to whether they last forever or not, and so we generally stick to about the 20 to 25 years.
So effectively we're saying that if we had $81 million invested, then the payback period would have to be over that 20-year life cycle of that building, which is based on where or current.
Yeah, but also you can make a decision to extend that out longer. Yeah.
Just one other question was just your second slide was just talking about types of debt, and obviously you said that there was business debt and borrowings are used by businesses for investment enabling future economic return. Is that something that council ever does or contemplates other than just the public debt for infrastructure?
We do, and so, but at times, I guess we exist obviously to provide public infrastructure for the public benefit, and some of that public benefit is actually leveraging it for commercial gain. So just like our roads are there, so you and I can can commute and travel to work, our roads are critical with regards to the economy of the country, with regards to transporting freight and all those sorts of aspects. And what we have done, and in particular around many of our public infrastructure, and a good example might be the forest loop with regards to the Waka Forest, is that there is a public amenity value to that, and there's a recreational aspect of it for our community. But what we also know is that it's attracting tens of thousands of visitors into the district as well, and so therefore there is someone that is gaining that economic benefit from it. It's very hard for us though to calculate the yields and return that a business would with regards to a specific piece, like I'm buying a truck, etc. But yes, there is an element of that. Good examples would be obviously the airport. There's an element of economic benefit of having that. I think the forest project was one of those with regards to particular Te Tukarangi Drive, with regards to the huge number of visitors that visit the redwoods, the mountain biking, the lakefront as well, with regards to attraction for visitors and amenity. And so even to the degree of the Sir Howard Morrison Centre, while there's an element of, obviously, as we're talking about commercialisation of it, there's an element of public amenity with regards to public access and use and community wellbeing. There's also the commercial return and aspect of it. So for us, it's generally a blend of the two, and at times we put the public infrastructure in, and others might get the more direct commercial benefit, but we do recover those costs, I guess, ultimately through appropriate levels of rating and so forth.
Thanks, Thomas. That's a good answer.
Any further questions, councillors? Yes, Councillor O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For you, thank you, Thomas. Could I just follow up on a point that Councillor Kaifong came up on managed retreat? I see it's not listed down as one of our risk factors, but if I could give you the example of the sad tragic events at Matata, for example. Now, if we look at some of the lake surrounding homes, looking at if this current rain, say, roughly continues to fall in the same following years, given that we, I assume, are responsible for handing out the building consents or signing them off, have we put contingency for risk into what those sort of numbers may look like, particularly in the next future years? Thank you.
Yes and no. I think that's a wider question of, obviously, who holds the resource consents for these lakes and how are they managed and how can they be managed going forward. And I think we all hope that we'll see the end of this sort of rain that we've had experienced over the last 12 months, where it's rained nearly every day. For us, there is an understanding of more some of our public infrastructure and the impact. So you'll have seen photos that we know that there's boat ramps that are underwater and jetties underwater, and there are toilet blocks at risk and those sorts of things. It has been hard to quantify because what we don't know is, will it continue, will we lose a lot or not? And so we haven't taken that into account. But I'm not sure it's 50 million as such. It's probably a smaller number. For us though, we do have our renewal budget that sits there that looks after and maintains our assets. So it is anticipated that as the water levels recede, that we'll have to redeploy and prioritise that funding towards reinstating some of those assets versus providing for a contingency. But if it is substantial and it can't be done under that, then that is an item that we talked about with regards to having appropriate headroom that may have to be funded from that headroom. Yep.
Were there any other questions? Yes, Councillor Kaifong.
I seem to be asking a lot of questions. Just in relation to that taking away of the debt of Three Waters, so on those graphs there, that assumes that debt is going with Three Waters or not going with Three Waters?
No, this graph assumes
not going.
Not going. Yeah.
So in that situation, if we were repaying them over the life cycle of the museum over the next 20 years, then we're going to hit one of those lines, 2029, 30, 31, 32, 33, potentially?
Yep. So if we deliver on our full capital works program for this year and borrow the 61 million, and we do all the things that we said that are in the remainder of our long-term plan on the basis of how it's planned, plus those risks on those other projects materialise and we have to fund, we will hit our projected debt limit in 2029, at our internal debt limit. We will still have a buffer of about $50 million to our actual external debt limit.
Which could potentially be for those unidentified.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I think the take home for me, and hopefully you'll know by now, I'm incredibly conservative by nature. So if you look at this and say, well, what is the implications? What does this all mean, and what are the implications with regards to the decision that is in front of you? And so for me, knowing where we are and where the risks sit, I don't believe we're in a position to be able to fund the whole shortfall for ourselves with regards to the difference in funding. And in particular, with a project of that nature, funding that shortfall, and while there's an element of contingency built in, there will likely be an element of cost escalation with regards to beyond that price because of the age and nature of that building. And I think with the two, and in particular when you look at year 2026, based on our current debt limit and where the council is signalling where you'd like your headroom to be, I don't believe we could accommodate those two together in this without entering into a long-term plan, looking at what those borrowings are being applied for in 2025 and 2026, and having to make decisions around rationalisation and deferment. In saying that, if the funding gap can be supported and filled with the help of community organisations and central government, and council puts in its existing $15 million contributions and carries the risk of any escalation above that, and if that escalation sits in the ballpark of about $10 million, then it can fit within this, and you wouldn't have to go through the process of doing quite a in-depth review of your capital spend or what's borrowing in the next couple of years and making decisions around deferment, stopping and so forth. And so I think that's, in my view, that's where it currently sits based on what we know at the moment and for now, and what we are anticipating into the future.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Is there any other questions before we finish this session? There appear to be none. Is there anything you'd like to add? That has been a really good summary, thank you, Thomas, and it's given us an idea of our debt levels, where we're at, and where we're planning to go forward with our infrastructure. Was there anything from you, Councillor Brown? I just noticed you there.
No, I would just say that the slide 13, which has now gone off screen, that CapEx risk, when we're talking about cyclones or earthquakes, managed retreat, museum overruns, I think that particular page is well underdone, and this is the reason why I think the whole thing needs to go through audit and risk.
Thank you for your comments. And if there's no other comments from... Yes, Councillor Lee?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just trying to get to the bottom of my previous question. I've got the financial statements here for me for the annual plan. It's got our total revenue at 194 million and finance costs at 14 million. Is that the interest only, or is that repaying of debt as well?
So, Councillor, what page of the plan are you looking at which says fine?
Can I show it to you?
Sure. Yep, so that'll be finance costs only.
Interest only. Yep.
Does that answer the question, Councillor Lee?
Yes, it does. That's interest only for those who didn't hear with the microphone yet.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes, Councillor Kaifong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to reiterate your final comment there, Thomas, is that the funding gap needs to be filled with other funding, so that we would need to put in our 15 or 15.5 million that we've already committed in the LTP previously, and that potentially the only other headroom we might have would be to go for an additional $10 million, which, if it was required over and above what the current build cost contingency is currently known at, but this would be conditional upon all of the other funding being available from other parties. Is that a
So-
good summary of?
Yeah, so there's a $28 million shortfall, which I know there's discussions around what other funding agencies will help us fill that. To borrow that and to also carry the risk of probably further cost escalations, and it could be 10 million or it could be 20 million because of the age and nature of the building, based on where we currently are with our debt and what we're projected to do, that will push us over in our internal debt limit, and you would have to make decisions going forward around future investment into infrastructure. And in particular, when I talked about what is driving our debt into the future, wastewater treatment plant upgrade, sewerage schemes and those sorts of things, it may not be as easy as what it appears to move the timing and changing of those to make sure that we all fit within the debt limit. So it will put pressure on us going forward, yes.
And that's also assuming that a 10 million over budget, if it was fully funded, is all that is needed if it went beyond the current budget and contingency. So if there were other unexpected things that they found once they took the roof off, which took it beyond an additional $10 million, we're then in real trouble.
Just remembering that within that price of 80 million that we were giving, there is a contingency built in that is based on the engineer's estimates, and you would have had that workshop previously where Desir in particular was explaining of how they worked towards that. And so there is a contingency built in, but there is a risk that therefore if that costs escalate above that, and that falls on obviously council to cover that, because it's very hard to get another external agency to do risk that for us, that if you were to fill the whole funding gap plus take on that risk, will put the organisation at the point where we will trip over our internal debt limit, and you would either have to make a choice to raise it, or you would have to look at what other capital investment was taking place and look to defer or stop, or find other ways of funding infrastructure.
Thank you, Thomas. I think that's a really good comment to just cover off the final comments that you made, because we need to have fairly good certainty then that what the build cost is going to be what the build cost is, because if they do find something that they hadn't anticipated because they hadn't managed to crawl into that nook or cranny, then we potentially will be in trouble if we start this project.
Yeah, just my final is that if we're able to achieve external funding to fill that $28 million gap, and the project is able to be managed within that, or if it was to go over that by another $10 million because of construction risk, that extra $10 million can be accommodated without having to do significant review or work on future capital investment. But obviously does ultimately eat into your future headroom, yes.
Thank you, Thomas. We'll just have a couple of last questions from Mayor Tapsell and then Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, there's been a lot of questions around the current debt cap, and I just wanted to have confirmed whether in the forecasting you've taken into consideration the ongoing costs of the museum. So of course there's the maintenance and renewal costs, and then depreciation costs. It's quite a significant asset, so all of those are also significant costs. And so just wanting to ensure that if the building was fully restored, those costs have been taken into consideration.
To the extent of what we'd have included into our long-term plan. So as long as they're still reflective of the current position, which I don't think it has changed significantly, then yes, we have.
And then just final question on that. We've talked a lot about the debt. There is a small amount of revenue. It only covers a small portion of the total cost of the museum, but has that also been included in the forecast? So to put that in perspective, the museum has been closed for some time now. Prior to that, the council would have expected that we were still receiving that annual revenue to offset the costs. So currently, is that revenue also reflected in the forecast?
Yes, so
I'm just trying to get a picture for us on There's a number of different variables to that debt cap. So wanting to know just how close we are and if we've taken everything into account.
So what we did in our current long-term plan is we anticipated a cost of completing it, which was the 53 million. We looked at what year that would likely been completed, and from that we built up those external revenues and those operating costs, and so they're embedded into the long-term plan. And so when we look at those, that debt forecast in particular from 2025, 2026 onwards, that is built into those, yes, based on what we did at our long-term plan. Yep.
Councillor Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick one. I apologise for not being here last week. The fit-out, 5 million, if I recall, was that included in this? Other documents I've read said that it wasn't.
Councillors, you recall the goal is to completely 100% fund the exhibition. So the fit out itself of the building with regards to mechanical services and those sorts of things is built into the price that we went out and consulted on. But the exhibition costs are about halfway funded externally already, and the team is still working on getting funding for the remainder of it. And so in our forecast, we anticipate that they will achieve their goal of getting at 100% funded.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions before we close this off? Yes, Councillor O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, Thomas, just to follow up on Councillor Pallison about the exhibition, because I have raised this before. Previously, it's been mentioned in our literature at about $10 million. And I understand there's roughly about half of that's been fully funded. Is that price still approximate now? Because it just seems a little surprising that in an era where everything else seems to be blamed on skyrocketing prices because of inflation, this seems to have stayed static for some reason. And if we can copy that formula, I'd love to see it used elsewhere too. Thank you.
That was the estimate at the time, and I think the team have been busy engaging with entities and mana whenua and other groups around the district around what that exhibition would look like. I guess ultimately though the exhibition can be scaled up and scaled down to fit the funding that's available, and I think that's probably the difference, whereas you can't scale up, you can scale up the seismic strengthening, but you can't really scale down the seismic strengthening. So you do have, or we have levers available to us if there is a funding shortfall to look at that exhibition and potentially scale it back temporarily while other funding is sought, or make other decisions.
Thank you, everyone. We might just bring it to a close there because we're reaching our time limit, and we'll just give us a chance to set things again for the next workshop session. I'd just like to thank Thomas very much for his presentation and giving us an idea of our position, our debt position, and how we fund our infrastructure going forward. It's given us a good idea of where we sit and where we, what we're looking like as we go forward into these very important discussions around the museum restoration. My apologies earlier, we didn't do a karakia, so we might just do that at the opening of the next session if that's okay. So if there's no other questions or business, we will close this session and go get ourselves ready and reset for the next workshop, which is at 3:15. Thank you.
Recording stopped.
to start off, and she will lay out the agenda and how we'll move forward. Thank you, Gina.
Tēnā tātou, I'm just trying to find the clicker. Thank you. Right. So just as you've heard, we've approached this in 4 parts. First, an overview of our existing funding, just so that everyone's clear on what we currently have and what that's directed towards. Secondly, we will talk about the current funding position, and in that we will talk about the funding gap. And then we will also talk about the pathway to close that funding gap. And in particular, as you will have heard in the previous session, we've approached this on the basis that there is a $29 million gap. We are proposing a pathway to address the full extent of the gap, such that council would be left with any potential overrun beyond the 81.4, which does include an amount for contingency. We will be talking about that with you in the confidential workshop on risk. So we have assumed that the pathway is required to cover the full extent of the current gap to get to 81.4 million. Okay, because we have quite a detailed presentation, I will ask that we hold questions to the end, if that's okay, and then we'll have more time for questions at the end. So, as we've said, we have staff here, but also we took the opportunity to invite Portia McKenzie, who is the Director of Regional Development for Kānoa. And the reason for that was that rather than myself trying to explain the processes around government decision making, we can talk about the application process, but probably better to hear directly from Crown officials around how they would treat, how they view our existing contracts, as well as the potential for the further $29 million that needs to be raised. Okay, so I will hand over to Amy at the moment, but we will all be available for questions.
Kia ora koutou, councillors. Thank you for having us today. Okay, so just to start with an overview of where we are at with respect to contracted funding for the museum project. So at this point in time, we have $38,350,000 contracted. The process to acquire this funding started after the LTP in 2018, where RLC committed to contributing $15.5 million. That enabled us to move forward and to work with the funders in terms of putting together the project budget at that time of $53.5 million. So if we just go through each, we have $17 million from Kānoa, that was made up of 2 different applications. $10 million from Rotorua Trust, $6 million from the Lottery Significant Projects Fund, $5 million from Manatū Taonga Ministry of Culture and Heritage, and we will hear later that they've also committed a further $4 million if the project does proceed, although that is not, the contract is not varied yet, so we haven't included that in this table. And most recently, just last month, in fact, Joe Doherty has been working hard again in terms of funding applications and secured another $350,000 through the Lottery Environment and Heritage Fund towards the project. So that's where we stand at this point in time. And so just to talk a bit about the process now, the previous table with a few lines on it looks quite simple, but there's a very, very large amount of work that goes into these funding applications. There's 2 examples here in the presentation for you, one for the additional Ministry of Culture and Heritage funding application in 2022, and you can see there the number of files that we had to provide, the extent of the information. They also require paper copies, and so it's literally 3 boxes of documentation sent to Wellington for them to assess. And when they're looking at that, they're looking at how well our application matches the funding criteria and what they're trying to achieve, but also, do we have a credible project that is ready to move? And that's quite a big focus, I think, of a lot of funds of recent times. Is I think the words often are used as shovel ready or spade ready, like how actually feasible and credible is the project. Another example, just the 350,000 that we just applied for, again, a wealth of documentation required to put together to be assessed in terms of whether or not that project will be successful. So I guess it's just wanting to demonstrate the amount of resource, the amount of actual pre-work that has to go into this in terms of business casing, concept design, resource consents, letters of report, and letters of support, and so on. So once, obviously, these funding applications are submitted, the funders assess them and they make their determination. If we're successful, then we enter into a contract, and at that point in time, the funder moves from looking at whether whether they want to fund us to actually holding us accountable that are we going to deliver on the outcomes that we have signed up to, and working with us in terms of how that project environment. So. As Jenna Rangi said, we've got Portia McKenzie here, Director of Regional Development, and I'm going to hand over to Portia to talk through, I guess, that side of the fence in terms of being the funder side in terms of expectations of the funders. Just before I get there, there's one more point that I hadn't touched on that Jenna's just pointed out to me, is that the work here is one side of the effort, but the other is the timing of it. And so a lot of these funds only have one round per year. Some of them don't have a round each year. Some of them come up at different times, or maybe miss a year. So it's not only, I guess, preparing this information, but it's preparing it in time for that one opportunity that you get for some of them.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. My name's Portia McKenzie. I'm the Director for Regional Development for Kānoa. Kānoa is a separate unit within the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment that has been set up to support regional economic development and investment throughout New Zealand. We manage a series of funds on behalf of government. At the moment, we are managing 10 different funds across the country. Each fund is initially set up by Cabinet, and it all depends on what the government's policies and initiatives are and what issues and challenges that the country is facing at the time. And an example of this is we are currently managing a fund to support primary industries relief for cyclone damaged properties. So every fund that is set up has its own specific criteria that we're trying to achieve through that funding envelope. In this case, the application from the Council for the museum was through the Provincial Growth Fund, and that fund is fully exhausted now. The Provincial Growth Fund had a set criteria, and it was all about ensuring that the provinces were growing and there was growth into those provinces. In this case, the museum is part of a wider, bigger piece within a larger precinct, which includes the lakefront, which we supported through funding, Wairiki Spa, which we supported also, QE Health, through to the forest as well. So all of that is part of one big piece that we've supported for Rotorua in a cluster of projects. When applications are put to us as officials, we are expected to take into consideration all the information, assess it in terms of that criteria, and that information gets put back to ministers. So no decisions are made by officials. There are no delegated powers in terms of funding. The application that was submitted to us in 2019 was in the criteria that that the museum would be fully strengthened and reopened as a museum. So when we went on to contract that, all of those terms and those conditions as part of the application get put into the contract for funding. So technically we are purchasing outcomes on behalf of the government. And then that gets put into some milestones, and that then recipients are expected to follow through on that and draw down on funding as a project moves along and is delivered on. So in this case, the deliverables really are all about ensuring that it is part of a much wider precinct piece, that it is restoring the museum and upgrading it and giving it that digital and interactive experience, but ensuring that it's also meeting all of the building standards as well. We've already paid out 10 million of that funding, and if this wasn't to continue, then we would need to have the discussion around recuperating some of that funding back and repaying it. So in terms of the funding, Amy, you want me to speak to the arts and culture funding as well? Yep. So I've been speaking with the Ministry of Culture and Heritage as well, because the government funding is seen as a package between both ministries. So in this case, the funding from the Ministry of Culture and Heritage was initially a 5 million fund, which was approved in October of 2022. Sorry, that was approved in 2019, 2020, yeah. And 2.5 million of that has been paid out. In this case, the contract with them is also directly linked to an outcome, which is a fit-for-purpose museum. So again, the contract is purchasing outcomes, and it's purchasing a fit-for-purpose museum. That funding with Ministry of Culture and Heritage cannot be transferred for any other purpose, and they've already paid out 2.5 million on that. However, that contract has currently expired. It can be extended and renegotiated. However, they are waiting on a decision, a council decision, so that they can have that conversation. In recognition last year of the challenges that this project is facing, there was an additional grant approved of 4 million, and that's available also to extend into that contract of 5 million to take it to a total of 9. However, that again is really linked to those original rules, is that it must be a fit-for-purpose museum. If the funding was, if the project was not to proceed, then there would need to be, that 2.5 million would need to be repaid and recuperated back. And if a new application was made for any subsequent project, then any decision, any application would need to go into funds that are available at that time. So, for example, an application to the Ministry of Culture and Heritage would be contestable. It would go into a tranche situation, and it's highly contested, that fund at the moment, from around the country, so that would be going up against a number of applications. In terms of funding with Kānoa, we go on to the Rotorua Trust next. So in terms of the funding with Kānoa, we no longer have the Provincial Growth Fund available if a new application was going to be made. So we have currently the Regional Strategic Partnership Fund, and it is significantly narrowed compared to the Provincial Growth Fund. It is quite a different fund from the Provincial Growth Fund. It's specifically commercial, it's linked to commercial outcomes. So one of the recent applications that we approved was the Pika Block in the last couple of weeks, significantly linked to those commercial outcomes, and we're looking at a loan situation, not a grant. The other issues that need to be considered for any new funding application is that you'd need to submit a significant number of documents and as part of that application, as Amy has explained before, is we would be looking for a full business case, concept designs, and all that detail that needs to be submitted as part of an application. And we're currently in a situation where we're coming to the end of our funding round at the moment, and there is uncertainty in what those decisions would be going forward. For any additional funding beyond the 17 million that we've already provided, there could be a request for some further funding to top that up. There are a number of cost increases that are happening to projects around the country. That request would need to go to ministers for consideration. That's not a decision that is made by officials. As every fund has different criteria, in terms of the Provincial Growth Fund, if there was a request for an additional top-up there, because the threshold is 20 million, anything beyond 20 million needs to go to Cabinet. So that's also something that needs to be considered as well, is could we get a Cabinet paper onto an agenda? And at the moment, considering the current challenges of this government, getting it onto an agenda could be quite challenging. So I think that really does sum it up. That helps, Amy?
I think there was one question that I had, which I think probably would help to clarify. You said that the PGF is fully exhausted, but there is the possibility to increase. How does that work?
So we would put that to ministers. There is some funds being recycled through the PGF that were loans, and repayments of those loans are getting recycled back through. So there could be a little bit of funding there to request from the ministers.
But that's for an increase in existing contract rather than...
Yes, yeah, not a new application, no. So if it was under 20 million, then that would be a decision by regional economic development ministers. And if it goes beyond that 20 million threshold, that's where it becomes a Cabinet decision.
And does that include the existing 15.5 within that 20 million?
17, sorry, the existing 17, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Portia. I'm sure the councillors will have probably questions for you at the end, no doubt. Okay, so if we just move on, I'll cover off the last two of the major funders, and then we'll get into our overall position and where the gap is at. So Rotorua Trust, and we have Stuart Edwards here, so thank you for coming along. Today, we have contracted with them $10 million of funding, and again, similar to the central government funds, that is for a particular set of outcomes, which notably is to complete the seismic strengthening, restoration and redevelopment of the Rotorua Museum, Te Wharetonga Aotearoa. Like all of the funds, we did commit to a certain level of strengthening, which was 80% of the new build standard, and went back and renegotiated that to 70% of ground and 80% of building, which we talked about last week. Now, we have been talking also in terms of any further potential funding, and we've been given an indication that there could be a potential of 5 million more if Council made a decision to move forward with the project to help close that gap that we have, the 28 million. And also, I guess, a clear steer that there would be, the Trust would be likely to seek return of monies paid already, which is $2 million if the project was not to go ahead. Like some of the other funds, priorities have also changed. So I guess I note that, when we applied to the Trust, they had, I think, 4 key kind of focus areas, and they've since changed those to 5 of them, and so they've switched out employment as a focus area to healthy families and environment, education, strengthening communities and vibrancy remains. And that's essentially where we're at with the Trust. Lotteries. So there's 2 funds that we have received approval for funds for here. So there is the Significant Projects Fund, which we have a contract for $6 million. Significant projects are projects that are of a total cost of $3 million or more for a community purpose for public use in New Zealand, and they must provide regional and national benefits for outcomes in arts, culture and heritage, or sport and recreation, or conservation in the environment, community wellbeing, resilience, economic development, and or visitor services. So you can see, I won't read all of those out, but you can see again, each fund is unique in terms of what they actually pick out of the applications and put against their criteria in terms of the outcomes that they are seeking to purchase. It was a nice way of putting it, Portia, in terms of buying those outcomes. So in this one here, there's elements around mobility in terms of accessibility of the space, improvements around flows and enhanced facilities and climate control. So that's all in our design that you heard about last week as well. They also pull in their outcomes with respect to employment and the benefits that will have both during construction and post-construction. The second fund that we have received funding from is the Environment and Heritage Fund, which is the most recent application, and that was $350,000, and that is particularly around physical heritage projects that restore and protect or conserve places, structures and large built objects that are important to our history, and also cultural heritage projects to conserve, protect and promote collections and stories that are important to our cultural heritage and identity. Now, if we were to not proceed with the project, those contracts would be cancelled, and any other alternatives would need to have new applications made, and the $2 million that we've currently received would need to be returned. And I guess just as a note, Portia made the comment around the funds that they have at the moment being heavily subscribed in this environment. I believe that is the case in a lot of funds around the country. So just by way of example, this Lottery Environment and Heritage Fund, it was a fund of $5.7 million that they were looking to distribute across the country. There were over $20 million worth of applications made, so it was heavily oversubscribed in terms of people seeking funding in this particular space. Okay, so where are we at? This is, I guess, a graphical view of the table we had at the very start of the presentation, showing our contracted funding and the RRC contribution of $15.5 million that was committed in the 2018 LTP, and the most recent $350,000, which takes it to the $53.85 million. Now, when, I guess, we had the bulk of this funding secured in that 2020 period, we believed at that point, I guess pre-COVID, or 2019, 2020, that this would be sufficient. Obviously, since then, we have been through a very unprecedented period of construction inflation in terms of the environment following COVID, lots of stimulus and so on in the economy. And when we've gone out, completed the design and gone out to price the project, when we've added the construction cost into the costs we've spent to date, allowed for further professional fees in terms of the monitoring of the construction, allowed for any other miscellaneous costs that we have, allowed for contingencies and so on with respect to risk, we see the project ending at $81.4 million as we believe we will land in terms of the overall spend for the delivery of the strengthened and restored museum, and that has left us with a gap of almost $28 million. Okay, bear with me on this one, it's a lot of words. So if we start at the $28 million, I probably should have the Manatū Taonga up the top there, so I might just talk to that one first. We do know that Manatū Taonga, MCH, have said that there is $4 million that they will give us, or vary the contract from $5 million to $9 million if the project does proceed. So that would need a council decision to move forward. So that then reduces the gap partially. We have been in talks with Kanoa about accessing some of the, I guess, top-up type funding that potentially could be available given the escalations that we've seen. And we've been talking about a $5 million top-up there. Now, as Portia said, that timing is very tight, so we would need a decision when you meet on the 2nd of August that would enable that application to try to get to Cabinet before they close at the end of August. There is an alternative there in terms of a ministerial decision up to the $3 million threshold in terms of not kicking over the 20 that makes it go to Cabinet, potentially. But I guess they've been very clear that they need to see a commitment from Council before they will make that application. And Portia may want to talk to that further later if you would like to explore that at all further. We have the $5 million indication from Rotorua Trust. We have an application a fund for NZCT, which opens in July this month, which we're putting an application in for $600,000. And we have some generous members of our community who have publicly pledged art, which for an auction for the proceeds to go to the project. Now, we're not sure what the art is worth, but we've put in here an estimate of $1 million. So essentially, that all of the additional funding beyond what we had contracted adds up to $15.6 million. So that gets us down to a remaining funding gap of 11.95. So of an overall gap. Now, we heard Thomas Collet say that it would probably be one or the other. It's hard for Council to fund that gap and also potentially any risk that the project that we may have got it wrong and that may go over 81.4 million. So I guess where we're looking at that gap, potentially there is an opportunity to explore with the Bay of Plenty Regional Council. They are looking at a regional infrastructure fund. Now, it's important to note this hasn't been agreed by their councillors yet, so it's a discussion at the moment where they're going into their LTP workshops looking at creating a regional infrastructure fund. Decisions are still to be made on how that would be funded, which projects would fall into that, but there are discussions in terms of the museum being a potential project that could be a part of that fund. And so that would be an opportunity to seek a regional commitment, given that this is a building with national benefits, regional benefits and local benefits to the project, and we have significant national contribution and significant local contribution. So if we're successful with that application through the Regional Council, if they have the fund, then potentially we can bridge that gap all the way down to zero, leaving Rotorua Lakes Council to cover the risk of beyond the 81.4 million. So graphically, for those of us that like to think in pictures, essentially you can see the gap in the middle of the 28, essentially near 28 million, and then the reduction down with those additional funding opportunities to the 11.95 million. And that concludes my part of the presentation. I think we're ready to have questions.
Thank you for your presentations, everybody, and rich data. There'll be some questions, I'm sure. Would anyone like to start us? Councillor Patterson, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for your in-depth report. Just looking at the funds that would need to be repaid if for some reason we decided not to go ahead to this, added that all up and it came to 13.5 million. So has that money been spent or is it just sitting in an account somewhere?
That's probably a finance question, but my understanding is that I guess we manage our cash flow in terms of we don't have money sitting generally in an offset kind of account accruing interest. We spend it and we need it at that time of year. Sorry, Thomas, I'm doing a bad job of this, I think.
A portion of it has been spent because we've obviously invested a fair amount. The two tranches of funding that we've received from Rotorua Charitable Trust are actually sitting on term deposit, and the balance of the other funds are held within our current net debt position. So it's a mix of all three. So
just to get a clarification, how much have we spent in actual dollar terms now? Because this probably was raised last week, but I wasn't here. And then out of this, on top of that, what would that cost be to us as a council? If that decision is made to not proceed, what will the overall cost to this council be by not going ahead?
So the first question was how much have we spent to date, and so you recall in the consultation document that 8.5 million was the spend to date, and then the second question was what if we were not to go ahead. The projections that we had was around another 1.5 million in order to close out those contracts and to make the building secure in terms of fencing and so on, and then yes, obviously we would need to repay the funders that we have received funds for. So that would be the majority of that 10 million, say, would be at our ratepayers' expense or our council expense.
So what's your actual estimation off the top of your head? What will it cost us in total? So what would the total cost to us be? If we decided right now, no, we're not doing it, what's the, if you add up all the money that we've borrowed or been, given in grants kindly by our supporters, and then what we've spent to get us to where we're at, what would be the cost of walking away?
So the total cost in terms of spend to date plus closeout costs would be 10 million, and then that would be our cost less any funding that we can potentially retain. So having reviewed the contracts, and we've got Portia here, the interpretation of the Kanoa contract is potentially that we may be able to keep a proportion of the spend to date from that contract, but that would need a conversation which we haven't had yet, so it's a little bit awkward in terms of how much of funding would potentially be retained. So it would be 10 million less whatever the funders may decide to leave with us potentially. So,
can I just say a shorter way of answering that is in the report to the 10 May meeting, which started the consultation, we reported to you that the cost to stop the project, including costs to date, plus any remedial work needed, was $10 million. The cost to council would be 7 million from that 10 million. And so that was what we estimated at that time. That's subject to us, we may be able to negotiate more or less from other funders to hold on to what they've received, but our estimate at that time was 7 million.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Tapsell?
Thank you, Madam Chair, through you, and I'm sure we may have some comments after. Welcome, Portia. Great to have you back in the building. Welcome, Joe, and I want to acknowledge Stuart Edwards in the gallery as well. Thank you for being here. Just a question around the ministry government funding in particular. When council does make the decision, which will be very shortly, if the decision is to proceed with option A, does that then lock in all of the funding, or are there still some staged approaches? And I'm just asking that question because there seems to be a lot of uncertainty on just how much of the funding will be retained depending on what option is pursued. So if any of those options are pursued to continue with the building being a museum, is that 100% of the current funding already committed? And then at that stage, will there be the opportunity for further discussion to confirm further funding if needed?
Through you, Madam Chair. Yes, that is correct. So for the culture and heritage funding, that is secured if the project was to proceed, strengthen as a museum, and that's the same for the funding through Kanoa, and that would then open up the opportunity to have a discussion about that further funding as well.
And just regarding the uncertainty as well, because I know that timeframes are tight and we do have an election coming up as well. So in terms of contractual obligations and when that money is committed and or transferred, will that also mean that once the council does make its decision, although in August, that will still be 100% committed to be received by us, no matter what happens? And I'm not, sorry, I have not seen the contracts for the funding, and perhaps it states it within there, but what I would like to avoid, I suppose, is us making a decision based on the information that we have before us, and then things changing in future and the ratepayers ending up in a difficult position and this organisation in a difficult financial position. So I'm just wanting as much certainty as you can provide us.
Before we start that, can I say from a staff perspective, if council were to agree to proceed with option 1, well, with the project as it currently is. We would communicate that to the funding agencies and work with them to secure the additional funding. We would not present back to you a construction contract to approve, which is really the trigger when the council becomes liable, unless you had confidence that the funding was available to meet your obligations. So that's how we would manage it from this end, but I will leave it to Portia to talk about what that means from a government perspective.
So we have a contractual obligation to follow through on that funding that we've already approved. The request for the additional is more uncertain at the moment, but what we do require and what all external agencies for funding will require and likely do is that the community, meaning council and its other funding partners, so the community as a whole comes forward with that co-funding. So we cannot move forward and put a decision up and request a decision on further funding until we know for certain that that co-funding is there.
Well, sure, it might be worth clarifying. So the co-funding, it can be from, for example, other funders such as Rotorua Trust or the Regional Council. It doesn't have to be from Rotorua Lakes Council.
Yes, that's right. So the co-funding can be made up of any community organisation, whether it be local, regional, government, philanthropists, other trusts as well. So when Ministry of Arts and Culture have put in an additional 4 million and you're asking Kanoa for an additional 5 million, which is a total of 9, we're anticipating at least a 9 million matching co-funding.
Thank you. Councillor Kaifong.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question perhaps through you, Chair, directed to Portia, just to get confirmation around that additional funding. So I took it from your presentation that you were to say that for us to achieve any further funding that it would need a cabinet decision and that the timing would be very tight and that we would require a council decision before the 2nd of August. So is in fact that really realistic, given that I understand that the government kind of has a protocol to prevent any additional spending beyond the ordinary once it gets to around about this time of the year, mid-July?
So back to that, up to 20 million threshold, we can make we can put a decision to our regional economic development ministers, the RED ministers. So if we've got 17 million, so that's up to 3 million, and that can be made by their delegated power or their authority. A decision, they have a meeting on the 23rd of August. So we could potentially put a paper up to them by then. Anything beyond that 20 million total would need to go to Cabinet. And yes, so getting a Cabinet paper on the agenda at the moment would be challenging.
And can I just clarify, I think you mentioned that for any further funds that there needed to be a full business case. And I think that was communicated to Mayor Tapsell and myself when we met with Minister Kerry Allen at the museum for application for any further funding from that. And that was part of the difficulty, is that we couldn't provide a full business case for a commercial return to be able to access further funds through the PGF or the Kanoa funding.
No, not a further business case. What I meant there was, if this project was cancelled and it was in a completely different form and a different shape, then that would be a whole new application, including a new business case.
So for any further funding, we wouldn't need to provide any further additional information other than simply make application for a further $5 million?
Yes, so the request for the further funding and the reasons why.
Okay, and just one final question, which was just around the MCH funding. So has that actually been, have we got a funding agreement in place with that, with a subject to us making a confirmed decision to proceed with the museum, or is that still subject to further consideration by whoever is the minister or government official?
No, that decision has been made. There is no further approvals needed on that. It's a contract matter, and they're awaiting Council's decision to proceed with the project.
Okay, thank you.
So to further to that, they've provided us a letter where they're very clear that the additional 4 million would be a variation to tie in to make a total of 9. So it either for the project proceeding in its original form.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Yes, Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know if this is a question for Portia. I was just looking at the Ministry for Cultural Heritage information that was put up on the slide, and I noticed, I think you mentioned, Portia, that you're in the business of buying specific outcomes. One of the items on the list here for MCH is strengthened and repaired roof. It's a tricky outcome to buy. You can't get them off the shelf for our building. I checked, I was at Bunnings last weekend. The water tightness of the building came up last week when we had the experts here. Water tightness, if a building is not watertight, then you're potentially going to have problems. And those problems are likely to be in the roof, which is where water tightness issues might present themselves. The pond that I'm fishing in is that a lot of the risk that we're going to have to manage is likely to be associated with the roof. Now, if you're in the business of buying specific outcomes, is there a way that you can take responsibility for that risk? In other words, it is not necessarily a fixed price for fixing this roof, but that's likely where most of the risk is going to be.
We don't own the building, so that is a matter for your ongoing maintenance and operation of that building.
Would you like to?
Thank you, Portia. Was there any other questions? Yes, Member Tapsell.
Thank you. If we were to take this through to a minister or to a cabinet, would that require a proposal? It would require a proposal to be undertaken quite quickly, wouldn't it? I'm just thinking of timeframes because I did, at the end of May, reach out to Deputy Prime Minister Sepuloni, who is the Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage, requesting an urgent meeting, preferably by the end of June. Unfortunately, she referred us on to Minister Willow Jean, Associate Minister Willow Jean, and we, as far as I'm aware, haven't heard back. So we have been trying to contact. The offer was there for myself, Deputy Mayor, and also members of the community, in particular the Museum Centennial Trust, to actually travel all the way to Wellington to meet them in person to discuss how important this is for our community, and actually the desire to find a better solution and also remove some of that uncertainty in terms of the significant cost to a small group of local ratepayers. So I suppose while we do have in front of us today a potential solution and potential funding, I still have great nervousness that this is only a potential, and while we could approve and make a decision in August, we could still be left with a significant shortfall. So just would seek your advice on what the best way is for us to communicate the importance of this to ministers and to Cabinet if required, when as a mayor and as a community we have already reached out and unfortunately in a month and a half has still not managed to secure a meeting or a response.
You still have the opportunity to make a decision based on the information that you have in front of you, knowing that you potentially have a funding gap as you move into delivery on this project, and continue to seek that funding over the course of the build. So that's one avenue that you could consider. And then considering, I know you're looking to make a decision on the 4th of August, if there is any opportunity to bring that forward and make a decision earlier, then that would give you a bit more time to get that paper in front of ministers for a cabinet decision.
Did that answer your question? Okay.
Sorry, just have one more thing, and that is that the ministers will see confidence when that decision is made, and they'll be able to make a decision based on that.
Is there any other comments or questions from the councillors, please? Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know it's not directly relevant to what we're talking about right now, but we've had a recent experience where an agreement was made and then a decision was changed, and we were left holding the baby potentially. So, I'm nervous that we go, yep, let's get into this boots and all and go, and then someone just decides, well, actually, no, we're not going to give you that money now. That's the one concern I do have. I know it's not directed at you, Portia, personally, and we can't control what people in the seats of power decide, but it then falls on our ratepayers. It's just, I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Just before we go any further, I think there's a question from Councillor Brown.
Yes, please. I'm just wondering how we manage the challenging timeframes. The decision at a regional council is not likely to come until the end of next year. Can someone just articulate how we manage the conflicting timeframes?
Thank you, Councillor Brown. So we'll cover off some of this at the final workshop with respect to contractual mechanisms that might be available to you to be able to manage that risk.
Cool, thank you. What I might do just before we go into discussion is see whether there's any closing comments from Gina or maybe even from Jeff before we move forward.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you for the presentation, Portia, for being here. And it's you certainly able to provide a different perspective than what we can provide as staff. I think the key things that we wanted to communicate today were first of all around debt and how the council funded portion is reflected in council's planning. And I think the key message from Thomas's workshop was that you do have some room on debt, but the reality is that you would not have the headroom to both meet the funding gap as well as carry any residual risk over and above contingency. And so we've understood that challenge and have really worked on the pathway to close the funding gap. We're confident we do have a pathway. However, it requires some time to work through the detail of that, and it is achievable if the decision is made to go ahead. However, you have a range of things that you need to consider in making that decision, and that's really going to be the focus of the next workshop, which is around risk and managing risk. So funding is only one aspect of the risk that you have to manage, and the timeframes around that are only one of the matters. I guess a key issue for us is the way in which we manage that risk. That will be not only the subject of the workshop, but it will be reflected in the final paper and the decision-making paper and the decisions that you need to make. The timing is challenging. There are consequences to making decisions, and there are consequences, and not making a decision also has consequences. So our task has been to try and marshal together as much technical information as we can so that you are best prepared to make the choices that you need to make. I think that's probably everything I needed to say. Jeff, is there anything you wanted to do to sum up?
If I can perhaps cover off, I think Councillor Patterson's concern. There's a couple of elements at play here that we've got working for us. A lot of this funding is locked into funding agreements, which are contractual agreements, and I think what you've seen is one side of the agreement where the funder is looking for us to do what it is that they are expecting us to do, and if we don't do it, we get to pay back the funds, is effectively the short answer. The flip side of that, of course, is that the funder is also locked in as well. So that's what funding agreements do for you. They give you that level of certainty as to be able to actually move forward, make contractual commitments based on other contractual commitments for funding. So I think that system should give you a level of certainty that the base funding is actually firm. That said, I think Portia's highlighted quite clearly that there are some uncertainties around, for example, additional Kānoa funding. That's really where the uncertainty starts coming in. It was alluded to, I think, by Gina, but the council can make a commitment to move forward, but that would obviously be dependent on funding certainty. I wouldn't see we would in any way recommend to you that we would sign some sort of contractual commitment to proceed with construction prior to having funding certainty. And effectively, the mechanism there is again removing that risk that, well, gosh, we've signed a contract to deliver this, but we actually don't have all the funding. That's not the situation we would recommend that you actually enter into. It would be actually taking the time to achieve funding certainty and then moving forward into a contractual commitment dependent on that.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Gina, for your closing comments. I'd like to now just open for a bit of discussion if any of the councillors would like to. Councillor Kaifong, did you have something that you wanted to raise?
No, I was just going to simply ask that question, which was around Councillor Brown in terms of the total uncertainty with the regional council funding, which is quite a significant portion of funding if it's $10 million plus subject to it hasn't even got to the councillors' table yet and is still a long way off to even be considered, if it is going to be considered. But I'd just go back to Gina's comment that we are going to be talking about risk, but I think funding is our biggest risk, because if we had all the money in the world, we could just go ahead and just do it. And I like the fact that, Jeff, that you've given us certainty that you will not bring us a recommendation that tells us to proceed unless there is funding certainty. And I think that it was good to have this discussion today. I'm still nervous that there isn't certainty around quite a significant gap in those little boxes up there, and I'd need a whole lot more certainty to be persuaded that the funding is available for us to be able to proceed.
Thank you. Any further comments from any of the councillors? Me Tapsell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you. Look, can I just acknowledge the incredible amount of work and generosity that's gone into coming back and providing with a solution. It wasn't that long ago that we still had that almost $30 million shortfall, so at least this has given us a plan to not only to consider but also to show the community that there is a possibility here. I do want to reflect Deputy Kaifong and also the councillors' concern. At the end of the day, we will still make a prudent decision. However, we have over 900 pages of submissions from our community that we'll also be considering in that time before August. So you can see this is a very complex project. I'm excited that we are reaching the end of this and we can finally give our community certainty within a month on what the future direction will be. But I do want to reassure everyone involved that we are taking all information on board, we'll be considering it, and at the end of the day we will act in the best interest of this community, not only now but for future generations. So thank you very much to the staff, and thank you to Portia for being here in person to provide not only information but also some advice on ways forward too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Tapsell. Is there any other comments from the councillors? Now, in that case, I would just like to thank Portia very much for coming to the meeting today to give us further background and help to demonstrate along with the staff the pathway to close the gap with the funding. Also, I really appreciate all the work that's gone in so far. There's been a lot, as we can see, already done, and a lot happened in the last little while to present these options to us. We will obviously have another workshop on risk, which unfortunately won't be open to the public, and this will help to add further background for us to make a decision on August the 2nd. On that note, if there's nothing further from our visitors and our staff, I'd just like to invite Councillor Wang to close with a karakia, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I'll add my very short comments into this as well.
That's fine.
Just to say thank you for Portia for coming as well, and to all the funders who I don't see as funders but partners in this project, including Rotorua Trust and Manatutaonga, Kanoa, and many others as well. The workshop that we had last week in conjunction with the two that we've had today has been incredibly helpful, I think, not just for us as city leaders, but also for the community as well, to understand the enormous amount of work that has gone into this project since 2017, the complexity of it, and many other aspects of it as well, as we've seen today. I am feeling a lot more confident now because of what we have seen from these last few workshops. However, I understand that there is still that uncertainty around the funding, particularly from the regional council as well, and I do hope that we can reach an agreement there, but really appreciate all the work that has gone on with this project from all our partners, from our staff, from the engineers, the architects, everyone. And to close the workshop today, kia whakaaerea te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūriki whakataha ai, kia tūriki whakataha ai, haumie, huie, tāekie.
Thank you, Councillor Wang, and I declare the meeting closed. The workshop closed. Thank you.
Madam Chair.